All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the UFS webinar. The webinar is hosted by the National Service and the National Weather Service Office of Science Technology Integration. The goal of this webinar series is to enhance communication and share advancements in all aspects of the UFS in both research and operational settings. My name is Alex. I'm here to help coordinate and deliver the webinar. And feel free to contact us at OSTI if you have any comments or suggestions. Also, we're always looking out for recommendations. So if you have any recommendations that you'd like to send in, please send them to ufs.modeling@noaa.gov, and we'll take those suggestions into consideration. Due to the high number of attendees, you will be in listen-only mode during the event. You will not be able to unmute. If you have any questions now or during the event, we will be putting a Google Chat document into the chat where you can post your questions and they'll be answered at the end. Today's presentation, presented by Dr. Jonathan Potter-Joy with the University of Maryland, is designing fully non-parametric state and parameter estimation methods for the UFS. Dr. John Potter-Joy is an assistant professor at the University of Maryland Department of Atmospheric and Ocean Science, where he leads a research group that focuses on uncertainty quantification for geophysical systems, new data assimilation methodology, and coupled atmosphere-ocean cryosphere modeling. Before joining UMD, John was a National Research Council postdoc fellow at the NOAA Atlantic Ocean and Meteorological Laboratory and an Advanced Study Program postdoc fellow at the National Center for Academic Research. John also held a postdoc position at the University of Oklahoma/NOAA Cooperative Institute for Mesoscale Meteorological Studies, where he worked with scientists at the NOAA and National Severe Storms Laboratory. He has a PhD in meteorology from Penn State University and a BS in applied mathematics and meteorology from Millersville University. So I'm going to change the screen back over to Jonathan and he can get started.
All right, thank you. Let me see if I remember how to share my screen. Okay, there we go.
Perfect, we can see your screen now.
All right, just takes a moment. Okay, thanks for the introduction. Today I'm going to be talking about sort of my dream about how to build what I'm going to call a fully non-parametric data simulation system for UFS as well as other modeling systems. And this work is going to be a mix of results that are supported by various NOAA awards, National Science Foundation, and even the STI modeling program. Motivating example I'm going to start with is just coming from one UFS application that my group is working on, which is a NOAA Hurricane Analysis and Forecast System. For those of you who are familiar with this model or HAVS, it is one of the first operational applications of UFS for regional scale for the weather, and became operational this year. Our group runs a very different version of HAVS than the operational version. HAVS typically is restarted off of the GFS and does some data simulation near storms as they form, whereas our version just runs continuous data simulation over a very large area shown in this domain. This is done for this demonstration, 6-kilometer grid spacing. And for this purpose, we're interested in bringing in new DA methods. I'm going to start with showing one such method that forms a non-parametric assumption for the prior that we use for data simulation. And then go on to another UFS application that focuses on sea ice to motivate non-parametric likelihoods. And so combined, I call them fully non-parametric data simulation. So just to state the problem of interest, whenever we're forecasting some natural system, we're interested in predicting, the state of some system based conditioned on past observations and our current observations. And so the best we can do for things such as the weather or ice or other applications is try to forecast a PDF. And so here in this cartoon, I have PDF of some future state X conditioned on observations Y up to our current time. And in order to get at this distribution, we have to know something about our probabilistic representation of our current state given all observations, and provide some definitions. Any value of X from this PDF can be mapped forward in time just using a model M. And observations relate to that model state through an operator H, which I call measurement operator. And errors in either H or the observations themselves are stuffed into this epsilon term. Likewise, even for the model integration, we have this eta, which represents model process uncertainty, which I'm going to actually ignore for most of this talk. And so in order to interrogate this problem of probabilistic data simulation forecasting, the way we do this is with ensembles. And so the basic idea of ensemble data simulation is we're trying to draw samples from this Bayesian posterior. These samples can be passed into our weather model and propagated forward to give us samples from our forecast PDF. When we're interested in doing state and parameter estimation, which is improving our models based on data simulation, the goal is to draw samples from P of X and theta, where theta is just some vector that stores all of our unknown parameters for our model, given observations. And so extending this cartoon, I also include this other PDF, which just shows a hypothetical PDF for an unknown parameter given observations. Really what we're after, though, is a joint estimate of these two. And so P of X and theta, whereas here I'm just showing marginals. And I'll talk a bit more about that right at the end of my presentation. And now, once you draw samples from this distribution for theta, they also go into the model itself, and so they inform how like a model forecast is made by just by selecting a set of parameters based off of what we did during data simulation. And so how are we treating this problem non-parametrically? I'm going to start with a description of the prior we use for data simulation. And so my group has been working for several years now on scalable particle filters for this purpose. Particle filters are just like ensemble common filters, which are commonly used in our field. A particle is just an ensemble member, and they're used to estimate prior and posterior densities in slightly different ways, which I'll describe now. And so for state estimation, we're after solving a Bayesian inference problem. And so just writing down Bayes' rule, if we want to get at this P of X given Y, we have to start with some prior and multiply through by a likelihood. For this prior part, we can use a non-parametric representation using a sum of Dirac delta functions, which I'm just showing here. And so I'll talk a bit more about this likelihood in the second half of my talk, but just for the particle filter, this is our assumed prior. This differs from an ensemble common filter in that we have this delta function approximation, which I'm showing on the right here, whereas a ensemble common filter takes samples from a forecast and just fits a Gaussian based on the mean and error covariance coming from your samples. And so if you have this this bimodal distribution here, we could still just fit a Gaussian based on the samples for an ensemble common filter. The advantage of these particle filter based methods are that even if our model M and H our measurement operator are nonlinear, and we have non-Gaussian errors for observations or other things, these methods still converge to the actual Bayesian solution, so long as we have a really big ensemble size without approximation. We do have to have a good handle on model process error and observation errors as well for this to work. Also, like ensemble common filters, various approximations are needed to deal with the curse of dimensionality through various means such as localization, inflation, and regularization. For example, ensemble common filters would never work for the big applications that we apply them for. if we didn't reduce the dimensionality of the problem by applying localization in order to independently update variables across our domains. And the specific data assimilation technique I'm going to be working with for particle filters is actually introduced in one of these Potter-Joy 2022 papers in QJRMS that brings in some new developments to this method that we're going to be using for some of these UFS applications. And so what is the benefit of moving from that Gaussian prior to a non-parametric prior? Well, without going into any forecast details yet, I'm just going to show a picture of what the vorticity field looks like at 250 millibars as represented by data assimilation in our halves experiments. And so here I'm just showing an animation of a ensemble common filter posterior member and a localized particle filter posterior member evolving in time simultaneously. And so from these videos, you see this multi-scale depiction of vorticity, which on the right looks a lot like an actual model state, meaning that if you ran a forecast value at this time, it's indistinguishable from an actual output from data assimilation. Whereas on the left, if I just freeze my frames here, you see all this noise that exists in this ensemble common filter member that just does not exist on the right. And all that noise is just the direct impacts of making that Gaussian assumption. Both of these methods employ localization to reduce the dimensionality of the problem. In fact, they do it in the same exact way. But the one on the left has this additional Gaussian fit for that prior. And the direct influence of the impact of that fit is to just drag the model state into unphysical directions. And if you were to zoom in on the same animation and just go down to 850 millibars and look at the evolution of two major hurricanes that formed over this video, you see a closer look at all this noise that you see in the smaller scales, which is again is coming about through these Gaussian approximations. Now, if you're a modeler and you're interested in say coming up with estimates of specific parameters within, say, a PBL scheme for tropical cyclones, it's much harder to deal with this type of solution that's being output from data assimilation versus one that doesn't have all that noise. And so that's another reason why it's helpful to go beyond this type of framework. In fact, I'm going to talk more on this parameter estimation part again near the end of my presentation. And so just to show some quantitative evidence of what I've just been describing in those videos, that this ensemble common filter tends to induce additional noise in our members. Here I'm just showing a average zonal kinetic energy spectra for one single member that I tracked through time over a few weeks. The dashed line that I'm showing in this figure is sort of a climatology for the FP3 model. If I just took 24-hour forecasts initialized from one member, and I took calculated the power spectral density of kinetic energy, and then just average the results, this is what I get. The red is showing the same thing for one localized particle filter member at 0, 3, 6, and 12 hours. And so 0 hours is just the output of data assimilation. And blue is ensemble common filter. You can see all this noise that you see in the smaller scales for wavelengths below, say, like 250 to 300 kilometers that come about due to those Gaussian assumptions that we make in the ENKF. And this noise dissipates over the course of, say, about 12 hours. But it's still sticking around by the time you do data assimilation again in a 6-hour framework. And so a part of the prior that you see for data assimilation still has some of this noise left over from the previous update that you did. Okay, and so that's just a holistic overview of what this data assimilation approximation does. Now, does it have value for NWP? So the next what I'm going to do is show some results in which we bring this localized particle filter into a classic ENVAR framework that's typically used for data assimilation. And so halves, just like other operational models, relies on ensemble variational data assimilation. The idea is we have a high resolution control state which we update using a variational method, whether it's 40 ensemble var or 40 var or 3D var. And to prescribe background uncertainty for that state, we bring in an ensemble. In the case of halves, it's brought in from the GFS ensemble. For the case of GFS, you just have an ensemble common filter running in the background, and then the 40 EN var just borrows covariance from that ENKF. And so in this case, an ENKF typically just updates an ensemble about this variational solution, and the short-term forecast from the ensemble provides background error covariance for EN var for the next cycle. And then there's a recentering step where these members are recentered around the EN var analysis. And so this is just what most operational DA systems look like right now. What I'm going to show is some comparison between ENKF var and PF var. So ENKF var is just running ensemble 3D var with ensemble common filter for updating the perturbations about the var state. PF is the same as ENKF var, except it just uses the localized particle filter for the ensemble. And so in both experiments, the role of the ENKF or LPF is just to update a 40-member halves ensemble about a variational analysis. And for verification, what I'm going to be showing is just selecting the first 10 members of the ensemble, running longer forecasts, and verifying them. And this was done every 6 hours over the 2 weeks of time where 2 major storms occurred over our domain. And we ran our experiments for a bit longer than this, but we ignored the first week to ignore our GFS starting point for our experiments. And I'm going to show some quick verification. And so on the left, I'm showing track and intensity verification for those 2 storms, Hurricanes Laura and Marco. And on the right, I'm showing domain average root mean square errors using error 5 as their verifying truth. And so looking at the 2 TCs, the top panel is just showing track root mean square errors. Red is our PFR experiments, blue is the ENKF var. And for track, we get a noticeable improvement in skill when we just exchanged the ENKF for the LPF, and results are a bit more mixed for intensity. At earlier forecast times, we get some improvements, but they tend to go away with time, partly because our sample size dies down as well. The dashed lines I'm showing here are the actual ensemble spread in our results, and I think one of the more important results here is when you're looking at generating a DA or piecing together a DA system for ensemble prediction, it's often really hard to maintain spread in ensemble common filter based DA methods, because you have to deal with a lot of unphysical adjustments that occur after you initialize your ensemble, and the direct impact of that is a drop in spread in the first 12 hours of our forecast with the ENKF var, which we don't necessarily see with their PFR experiments. And that's why you end up with a lot more spread in your max wins and SLP forecasts that I'm showing right here. And you get results that are a bit more consistent with the actual RMSEs, which is what we want. Likewise, for the error 5 verification over the entire domain, we see similar improvements with this PFR DA system. Last thing I want to mention on this topic is our group is going to soon be running this LPFR setup, along with a number of other non-Gaussian experiments, with an hourly updated version of the global forecast system. And an outline of this system is provided by Laura Slavinsky and her co-authors' papers here in 2022. And this is supported by a WPO award that we just received. And we'll also be bringing in this LPF into JEDI pretty soon. So these results were all performed using GSI. All right, and so that's the first part of this talk. It's essentially just motivating the use of particle filters for UFS type applications. The next step is going to be, looking further ahead and thinking, what else can we do, once we have a DA system of this type, in place. And so I'm going to go back and I'm going to just, revisit how we're solving this Bayesian filtering problem using particle filters. And this is just a slide that I had earlier where we just take this prior and we use a delta function approximation for it. If you go one step further, this likelihood part can be brought right into the sum of deltas, and you just apply it individually for each member. This allows for a lot of flexibility in how you choose these likelihoods. And so now you don't necessarily have to deal with matrix operations or the things that we use for, say, ensemble common filters or variational methods. Instead, you can form a very general specification of what this likelihood function looks like. And these guys are ultimately used for just weighting particles for the particle filter-based data assimilation method. And so first, let's revisit what we're doing right now for these likelihoods. And so the first assumption that we make is that errors are additive for the observations. And so if you just take y and subtract from it your projection of your true state into observation space through h, the residual part is just epsilon, which is just our error. And we make some assumption about that distribution of epsilon. For ensemble data assimilation, in the case of say weighting particles using for particle filter data assimilation, we have an epsilon n, which is just the difference between an observation and a member projected into observation space. And what we assume is that if we want to come up with, say, a calculation of the likelihood of a particle, so p of y given xn, we compute this residual, and then we just see where it is within a normal distribution that has a mean of 0 and an error covariance of r. There's two approximations that went into this calculation. The first is that the distribution of epsilon is independent of x, and so we're not modeling error dependence and observations based on what the true state may be, which is not a good assumption for a lot of applications. I'm going to show a specific one next slide. The second part is that the distribution of epsilon is modeled as a Gaussian, which may also not be a very good approximation for certain observations of interest. Classic example is probably rainfall, where we have a bounded quantity. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to motivate some idealized experiments based off of some of our observations running a coupled sea ice ocean model for the GFS. And so what I'm showing this picture is on the left, the evolution of the prior mean for Antarctica during a period where ice is undergoing rapid freezing, and so rapid extension of sea ice over Antarctica. On the right, I'm showing analysis increments and innovations that are coming from an LETKF data assimilation system within JEDI. And so this is actually just running the SOCA marine application for using JEDI. And so these all this coloring that I'm showing here is just the correction being made by the data assimilation. And all of these circles are the innovations, or just the difference between the observation and the prior mean in this case. And what I'm gonna do next is I'm gonna say, okay, I wanna have a picture of what the observation error distribution looks like. In the case where our analyses approach very small error, because if you have a lot of observations or if you're doing frequent data assimilation, in this case, 6-hour assimilation of sea ice, which is quite frequent. If you just take histograms of y minus h of xa, where xa is just your analysis state, you could come up with a general picture of what your observation error distribution may look like. Yeah, you have some analysis error in here, but the observation error should dominate. And so in this case, I'm just looking at histograms of y minus h of xa for passive microwave retrieval measurements for sea ice concentration. This is something that we know is bounded between 0 and 1 because it's a fraction of ice. This is for all measurements over a 3-month period during that period of rapid sea ice expansion. And first of all, I'm just going to take a look at this histogram. The red line is the prescribed distribution for epsilon, that we use for data assimilation. And so Gaussian with zero mean and an error standard deviation of 0.1. And I'm showing the histogram value over all the observations in this grayish histogram here. And you can see it has a spread that's a bit smaller than the prescribed error standard deviation we use for DA, which may seem suboptimal, and I'll show you why it's actually not in the next couple slides. And also this distribution is not quite Gaussian. It looks more like, say, like a Laplace distribution or a Cauchy distribution, which you have a highly peaked value here and slightly heavier tails. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to perform the same exercise, except I'm going to bin my histograms based off of different values of my analysis. I'm going to start with, let this video go through. I'm going to start with values of sea ice that are concentration between 0 and 0.1. And then I'm going to go in increments of 0.1 all the way up to 1. And so for the starting point, you can see that the binned values of these differences is far from Gaussian. It's actually a bimodal distribution. One reason being that we can't have negative sea ice concentration, which produces a lower bound on these differences. Another one is our sea ice values they could be 0, or you can have concentrations that are 0.15 and greater, just because of a lot of the uncertainty in the observation product, which leaves us with this gap right here, which gives us this bimodal distribution. And so again, on the tails of this, at least, this prescribed Gaussian is kind of the right thing to do out here, but it may not be the right thing to do over here. If I go forward to, I'm going to go to a case in which I'm right in the middle of this. I just let this video play through again. Yeah, I'm gonna go right into the middle of this distribution of sea ice, where I have values about 0.5 to 0.6, and you get another bimodal distribution that forms. This one actually, I believe, is coming from the observations being able to not distinguish between meltwater on top of the ice versus like what's beneath it, and so the observation may see something that looks like a small ice fraction when in fact there actually is a lot of ice underneath it, and so you end up with a bimodal distribution because of different properties of how the observations are trying to infer what the ice concentration is. And then I go further along all the way to the end where I'm looking at values close to 1, and here you have a highly peak distribution that has small spread, which dominates the results that you saw for producing a histogram for all of the observations. And here, this is when you're getting close to 1, and there's little uncertainty in whether or not you have a concentration of 100% or not. And so this result makes intuitive sense. Point of this exercise is we have large amount of differences depending on for the distribution of epsilon, depending on what the true state is. And some of these are very far from Gaussian. In fact, I don't think any of these look Gaussian. And so this motivates the latter part of my talk, which is going to focus on ways of coping with this type of problem, and leveraging some of our past work on particle filters to produce very flexible specifications of likelihoods during data assimilation. And so what I'm going to do next is I'm just going to borrow a toy model. I'm going to use Lorenz Model 3 from 2005. This model is probably the simplest one I can use that allows me to build in representativeness error in this problem, which is why I selected it. And I'm going to be performing data assimilation using this iterative localized particle filter from this QJRMS paper. And what I'm going to do is try to reconstruct a problem that looks a lot like that sea ice one, in which I have observations that have errors that have a strong regime dependence and are non-Gaussian. And so in this case, I'm showing an animation showing the time evolution of this model state, and all these dots are just my observations. And on the right, I'm showing two distributions. One is a positive bias, the other one has a negative bias, and so one of these I'm going to use to sample observation errors from whenever my state is positive. The other one I'm going to sample observation errors from it when the state is negative. And so that just gives me a very simple, easy to understand state-dependent bias or change in the distribution. I'm also going to be using a Cauchy distribution, again, to give me something that's never Gaussian, and and kind of resembles what we see for some of those sea ice examples. And we have two choices we can go with for this non-parametric specification of likelihoods. First is we can form a kernel representation of distributions, which we're going to do for both of these really. But we can directly model the distribution for epsilon given x. And so if I go back, here I can say let's try to estimate p of epsilon given x, which I'm showing here in this example. And just remember what these look like too, because it's going to come back in a few more slides. Strategy 2 is to form a kernel representation of distributions for y given x, in which case we bypass the estimation of a distribution for epsilon, and we solve the direct problem that we're after for Bayes, which is just a distribution for y given x. This strategy is more general in that we don't even have to specify a measurement operator. All we have to do is learn what that relationship is and use it for the likelihood specification. The downside is you need a larger training set, and so it's inherently more prone to sampling deficiency. But I will argue that we have a lot of observations and we have no shortage of data to estimate these things, and so I don't think that's a massive limitation. And so the way I'm going to do this is first I'm going to adopt a feature space representation of the data that we're after here, using a manifold learning method called diffusion maps. And so all that does is it takes the data that we're working with and puts it in a space that's easier to work with. And so a good example is one that I'm showing here. Say I have a nonlinear manifold. In this case, I just grabbed the Lorenz 1963 and ran the model for a while and produced points on the tractor basin that we're used to seeing, this nice butterfly shape. And then I applied diffusion maps to perform a dimension reduction of the data set. So instead of looking at things in 3D, I can produce a two-dimensional look at the data. And so on the right, I'm showing a 2D diffusion maps representation of the Lorenz 63 model. And all it really does is it gives you an easier way of computing Euclidean distances between points. If you were to compute Euclidean distances between points over here in this space, your distance is calculated off of the manifold, whereas over here all these distances are computed on the manifold. And so what that means is points over here in this lower part of this butterfly-looking thing are close together in this 3D space that I'm showing here. But if you wanted to go from one point to the other while staying on the manifold, and actually ends up being far away, which I'm showing over here in this 2D representation. And so both my epsilon or y and x are projected into this different space. And once doing that, it provides a orthonormal basis for representing data using kernel embeddings of conditional distributions, which is a nice framework that's been used a lot in the machine learning community for representing probabilities. Another positive benefit of using this framework is you only need linear operations to model what could be nonlinear dependence across variables in your system. And the end result of doing all this is we're going to construct this matrix A that is size n by n, where n is the number of data points or pairs of data points that you're using for training. And in this case, our training data is either going to be our observations and samples from our posterior distribution from past DA experiments, or samples of epsilon and posterior members, where epsilon is just y minus h of x. And to use with the localized particle filter, all we have to do is compute likelihoods of model states for the observations that we're given. And so for a given observation and a member, all we do is we identify the closest past member and closest observation from our training data and see where, where that lives in our matrix A. And that gives us the likelihood that we use for computing weights for the particle filter. And so going back to the application of interest, here I'm showing a time series of posterior root mean square errors for the Lorenz 2005 model. The red values are a case in which I performed data assimilation for with those observations that I showed, with complete knowledge of what the likelihood looks like. So I know what the P of epsilon given X is, and I use that during DA. And the blue value is not knowing any of that. And so I actually learn what those likelihoods look like and use them with the particle filter during data assimilation. And on the left, I'm showing just examples of P of epsilon given X that were computed for the last few cycles here. And this is a time evolving estimate of these distributions. I just used the last 40 cycles of data assimilation for training. And you can see I can nicely back out the regime dependence and the bias, as well as these nice Cauchy looking distributions. There are cases in which, for model variables that are for X close to 0, it's not really clear, what the distribution looks like. And what you end up with is a bimodal distribution, which is not perfect, but it's something that the particle filter can easily handle, which is why my results are still very accurate, despite that. On the bottom, I'm just showing what you would get if you were to perform the best possible Gaussian estimate of our distribution for epsilon, with also not considering time. And so this is essentially what we do for sea ice right now. And the result is not bad, but the error is still about twice as much as if you were to really use the right likelihoods that you estimated. And so that was all examples showing how to use P of epsilon. Estimating P of epsilon given X and using it during data assimilation. The next part is switching over to estimating directly P of Y given X, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a more general approach. And so for this case, what I'm going to do is motivate it by an application that is quite hard. The first one is the first part of this application is I observe the square of model variables in our system. And so instead of directly observing the variables, I observe their square, but I don't know it. And so DA doesn't know what the operator looks like. It just sees the observations and that's it. In which case, for our operator H, all we have to do is select state variables that we believe, share some error dependence here, or are needed for, like tying into observations. Also, the distribution of epsilon is still not given, just like the previous example. We don't know what that is. And then I'm going to make it even more hard. I'm going to say, on top of not knowing your measurement operator or your distribution of epsilon, we also start off with biased parameters. And so this model requires 5 parameters to run. They're actually given right here. And so if I were to write down the actual set of equations needed for running the Lorenz 2005 model, it's given by this PDE for Z. Z is just your state variable over this periodic domain. And it depends on X and Y. X is going to be the, sort of like the long wavelength feature that you see in this domain. Y is all the small wiggles. And so X is just a smoothed out version of Z. And how smooth it is depends on a parameter I. And Y is just the difference between the two. And so these parameters control, quadratic terms for X and Y, which influence, like how the full state Z changes with time. As well as a coupling term, term C, which influences how Y and X talk to each other, and then we have a constant model forcing term as well. And so none of these are known. We start off with pretty biased values, and we have to also learn them during, with this likelihood estimation stuff. And so just to show the end result of all that, on the top I'm showing the same figure I showed before, where I have a time series of posterior RMSEs. Red is the case in which I have a perfect model. I know the measurement operator, and I know the distribution for epsilon. Blue, I don't know any of that. I have to estimate it all using all these approaches. On the left, I'm showing just samples of P of Y given X and theta. They're very complicated looking. You could end up with even like some weird behavior at higher values. And so I'm not going to go into details on how to interpret these results, but they end up giving you the right answer, when you actually plug them back into data simulation, as evidence shown by the smaller RMSEs over here on the right. And at the bottom, I'm showing the actual parameter values that were estimated during data simulation. And I start off with a pretty massive amount of spread in my ensemble, and I allow like the actual likelihood estimation part to to identify what the likelihood is of model state in parameter for observations that we have, it's hard to see from the figure, but I have individual ensemble members plotted here, and so all of this shaded out region is just really a bunch of members that are accumulating around the truth, which is the dash value. And I'm able to back out these 5 parameters. Provide more detail on this parameter estimation part. The goal here is to estimate samples from P of X and theta given Y. And so that's the extension of our state estimation to both joint state and parameter estimation. And so we're trying to solve this, Bayes rule again for this specific part. And in principle, this can be done in 2 steps. This is not directly how I'm doing it, but I just want to point this out to motivate a specific design choice for this experiment that allows me to estimate all these parameters. First is you can perform a state update first. In other words, sample from P of X given Y. And then we can perform a parameter estimate that knows about how we updated X in those observations that we have. So that's P of theta given X and Y. And so in this part right here, note that if you're going to inform how to update parameters based off of posterior X values, you have some advantages there if you were to bring in maybe like large chunks of your state vector instead of point values, which is what we typically do for parameter estimation in our field now when we do like state augmentation with ensemble common filters. And so estimating likelihoods trained on subsets of variables in X has advantages, even if observations are just direct point estimates. Intuitively, that makes sense. The reason being that, like say, you're interested in a parameter that controls, like a smaller scale, signal in our smaller scale part of that signal in our model. You may want to say something about, like the gradients in Z, which is our state variable. And so it makes more sense to bring in a whole bunch of variables, so you can so you can tie together relationships that exist between X and parameters that may not just be easily inferred from point relationships. And so just to show a quick snapshot of that proves this point, on the top I have the same experiment I ran earlier, but with likelihoods only consider point values at locations, which means when I do my training to find P of, if I go back, my training to find P of Y given X and theta, on the top here, I just have point values of Y and X that go into that training. Whereas on the bottom, for my X for this training, I actually use 11 nearest variables at an observation location. And so this training is done, based on knowledge of a chunk of state variables near an observation. And what this allows me to do is hone in on some of these more difficult to estimate parameters. First of all, parameter K, C, well, I should say just say K and C alone are often very easy to estimate. K, for example, has more to do with a large wavelength feature. It's just the coefficient that goes in front of the quadratic term. Let's see, parameter B and I are tricky because B is the coupling variable. It tells you how the large and small scale features are coupled together, and I essentially tells you how much of your signal is going to be put onto your slowly evolving X variable versus the fast evolving smaller one. And so in order to estimate those parameters effectively, it's insufficient to do what we do now, which is to essentially just use point values of X to infer parameters. And so this is a key feature for this parameter estimation part that that leads to solving this problem. And it's something that you cannot do with conventional methods. You essentially have to have like a fully non-parametric DA system to do this. Meaning you have to start with, say, like a particle filter type method, so you can use very complex looking likelihoods. All right, so to quickly wrap things up, in summary, non-Gaussian DA is now feasible for high dimensional applications such as weather prediction. Early results so far in halves using this iterative local particle filter are quite encouraging, but they're really just scratching the surface of what we can do. First of all, I think the sample sizes are still too small to see the full advantages of some of these fully non-parametric methods. And the second part is we're still using just Gaussian likelihoods here. I mean, I can see using some of these techniques that I said are motivated by that sea ice problem, to solve outstanding issues for simulating all sky radiance measurements. I think that'd be a really nice application. Lastly, the maturity of non-Gaussian DA encourages the use of new research that focuses on the likelihood part for both state and parameter estimation instead of just the prior. And that leads us to the title of this talk, towards a fully non-parametric DA system that can be used for big models like the UFS. And with that, I'll take questions.
I'm going to change back to my screen and show the question document. All right. Are you able to read those questions off? Can you see them on your side, Jonathan?
Yeah, I can see them. Just give me a moment. So the first one is, can you explain whether there are significant difference between a PFR versus an ENVAR method with respect to the variational analyses? How do you get the background for the control, given the background distribution is not Gaussian? Good question. To answer the first part, yeah, I didn't comment on that just because I didn't have time. But we actually do have more skillful variational analyses as well. And so we did run deterministic forecasts off the variational analysis, and we do perform better than the ENKFR case. It's not as better. I think the results are a bit less, a bit more muted. I think largely because some of the benefit we get in the ensemble forecasts is because our ensemble is not collapsing on us for PFR, and so you just get a better estimate of the mean. So how do you get the background for the control, given the background distribution is not Gaussian? I don't quite understand that part. We'll talk about it later, maybe. On slide 24, I see that some parameter estimates, particularly I, have temporal evolution and longer cycle periods, as opposed to other parameters which quickly converge and hold near the true value. What would cause the parameter estimates to change over long periods of time? Thanks for your question, Ben. Let's see. I think a part of this comes from the fact that some parameters are just easier to estimate than others. And so it just takes longer for this method to converge to something useful. And so one hidden detail I didn't really speak much of in my talk was all these assumptions rely on there being pretty low error in your analysis, because we use analysis or posterior members as a proxy for the truth when training those likelihoods. And so if you're able to reduce posterior errors, then you get a better estimate of likelihoods as well as you go forward in time. And so if you have parameters that are really hard to estimate, you may have to estimate the easy ones first to lower your errors before getting to the more tricky ones. One thing I'm experimenting now with is time varying parameters to see if I can make some headway on that. Okay, question 3. Do you have thoughts on whether machine learning could help produce larger ensembles that would show greater improvements with the PF over E and KF? Absolutely, yeah. To me, that's the most exciting part of machine learning, is being able to just produce really big ensembles to combine with some of these methods that I'm talking about today. Because I wouldn't say we're really fully solving, like these non-Gaussian DA issues. We're just doing less badly than an ENKF. And that's always been my opinion on applying some of these ideas to really big problems. So yeah, definitely. All right, any other questions?
All right, sounds like we don't have any other questions. So thank you everyone for joining the webinar, and we'll see you next time.
All right, thank you.